that for every moment that you invest, we know that you put so much of your life into the games we make, and that for every moment that you invest, you feel like you are rewarded and you are given value for that investment.
That's Andrew Wilson, the CEO of EA, one of many in the games industry to claim that games as a service is the way of the future. Who remembers him saying, "We're now in a world where people no longer want to be static consumers of content"? Kind of a weird thing to say, right? Wilson was one of the first people all the way back in 2017 to claim that live service gaming was the way of the future. And he wasn't the only one. Phil Spencer from Microsoft and Strauss Zelnick from Take-Two also echoed these sentiments. And these are only a few people, but this was the general consensus from parts of the game industry. And of course, this has all aged like milk. It's early 2023, and these live service games are dying by the dozens. So what really is going on if this revolutionary idea for game development leads its own games to the chopping block? Is it actually an issue with each game itself, or a deeply rooted problem with the live service model? So let's first quickly discuss, what is live service, or games as a service? I know you've probably heard these terms 1,000 times, but here's how it works for those who don't know. Typically, a game starts with an idea. Once this idea is fleshed out, production and development can actually begin. The devs will code, design mechanics, write the story, record lines and music, test the game for bugs and exploits. The list goes on and on. Eventually, once development is finished, the game will finally release. At this point, most games won't see much change after release, except for small patches for quality of life or fixing bugs that might be reported by players. Live service games, on the other hand, take a slightly different approach with post-release. Once the game is out, developers will continue this development cycle. Post-release oftentimes will include bug fixes, buffs or nerfs to in-game items or metas, and most importantly, new content for the player base to enjoy. Side note, did you know the first live service game came out in 1986? Habitat was a game developed by Lucasfilm that supported a, quote, living multifaceted world. You can create a character, and you can explore a large world and interact with people across different landscapes and rooms. What's great about it is that Lucasfilm continued to make new content and listened to the player base long after launch, and it was all run on a network of Commodore 64s. While the original servers are long gone, you can still experience this game through emulation. Anyway, why are so many live service games shutting down if this design philosophy sounds so good on paper? On screen is a list of about 20 live service games that have either shut down entirely or their live service portions have ceased development indefinitely. And all of these titles have shut down in the last 4 to 5-ish months. That's less than a year. But seriously, how could this many games all go kaput in such little time? Well, I decided to take a look at all the data. I read blog posts from devs, watched YouTube videos from prominent members of each of the game's communities. I pored over reviews and was even able to find some financial information. This is a lot of data, and it was a challenge trying to look at it all in the bigger picture. But I did find one reason why I think almost every one of these games failed. And you probably already know why. I believe that these live service games shut down in such a short time because they were unable to capture a retentive audience. So why is audience so important for live service games? It's important because of money.
I like money.
Making a game is really expensive. According to Rocket Brush, the average cost of a AAA title is about $80 million and approximately $250,000 for an indie title. Finding exact figures is tricky because of all the different factors in game development. Companies have to factor in the cost for, well, developing the actual game, but they also have to figure out how many people are working on the game, the technology that is being used, or if new technology is being developed for the game. We also have to consider marketing before and after release to get hype around the game. We also have to pay all the QA testers and people who are finding bugs, and it's all a part of this multifaceted, complex process.
Hey guys, finished testing that game yet? I've got another one I need designed.
We just finished level 3 and need to tighten up the graphics a little bit.
Great.
But once a game is finished and gets released, less money gets spent on it because, well, the game is done. This is not the case for live service titles, on the other hand. With live service games, all of the previously mentioned factors have to be considered for cost on top of continued development after the game launches. The company has to keep making content, they have to keep QA testers, they have to maintain their game, they have to create balances and patches for metas, and if the game is multiplayer, they have to pay for servers. Fortnite, for example, uses Amazon Web Services and their C4.8X large instant type to run the servers. If we're generous and we don't include a variety of factors that might increase or decrease the costs, a typical quote for one of these instances is about $1.59 an hour. Epic has stated that they vary the amount of servers running depending on player counts. But let's assume they run about 2,500 servers on a busy day and 500 on a slow day. If we do the math, that's 1.59 times 500, which equals $975 for all of the instances. Then, if they each run for 24 hours a day, that's about $19,000. And if they all run for 30 days, that's about $572,000. And that's assuming the whole month is slow. If we did the same math, but for a busy month, where they have 2,500 of the servers running, that would equate to about $2.8 million. While these are estimates and AWS is only one example of a server provider for multiplayer games, it can get really expensive really fast. And that's why having a player base for live service games is so important. Specifically, these kinds of games need a few specific things with their players to really thrive. First, they actually need people to play the game. Duh. But they need their players to actually want to buy the content available in-game. This sort of idea is called the average revenue per paying user, or ARPPU. Basically, this is a way to track how many players start as a free-to-play player, or just buying the base game kind of player, and then when they become premium players who spend money on DLC or microtransactions. Having a high ARPPU is critical for the success of live service games, especially if they are free to play, as this might be the only way that the game really makes money. If we look at more metrics from Epic Games, Fortnite players spend on average about $84.67 on skins in 2018, and they spent about $100 in 2020. Epic also stated that about 77% of players bought at least one microtransaction since starting the game. If we're generous again and say that about 40% of the player base spent the average of $102 a year, Epic still makes an astronomical amount of money on microtransactions alone. And while Fortnite is more of the exception and less of the rule, it's still a great example of how lucrative this model can really be for a company. But herein lies the problem. If a live service game fails to capture an audience, it can't generate more revenue to support post-launch development. Now, we can deliberate, discuss, and debate why these games fail to retain an audience until the cows come home, but there have been a swath of complaints and criticisms from players about these types of games. Most people complain that live service titles don't have enough content to play at launch and use the live aspect to finish the game years later, or that some titles launch with too many microtransactions even though the game is premium priced. The one complaint I do agree with, however, is that players feel there is an oversaturation of live service titles. I'm tired of watching the reveal trailer for the 18th first-person, third-person isometric perspective looter shooter gacha game. There are a lot of live service games that I feel are too similar to each other. Not to mention, it feels like there aren't enough people for all the games to actually have a large enough player base. As someone who plays Destiny 2 and Warframe semi-frequently, I don't find myself wanting to play more live service shooters because of the time I spend on those games. This is both parts because I enjoy the gameplay of these looter shooters and because they're designed with player retention in mind. Another side note, it feels like some live service games really want player retention, but instead of making good gameplay or exciting new content or interesting mechanics, they instead use grindy gameplay to artificially extend playtime. I'm looking right at you, Destiny 2. I don't know if it's just me, but I can't stand this grindy gameplay like I really used to. Despite the many reasons why players are so critical of the live service model, situations where a game gets shut down is a loss for everyone. It's a loss for the player since they can't play their favorite game anymore. It's a loss for the development company and publisher because they lose money and they might lose trust in their own player base. But in my opinion, I think it's the biggest loss for the developers.
Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm the game director of Knockout City. We were hoping to pair this message with details about Season 9, but it seems like the cat's out of the bag. So let's talk a bit about the overall state of the game as we get closer to the end of our second year. One thing that we've continued to struggle with, even after going free to play, is retaining enough of the millions of new users coming in to keep the game active and sustainable. The truth is, it's been extremely difficult for our small studio to make the kind of changes necessary to bring back a larger audience in a game that's live and needs continuous support.
I'll say this again, I'm not a video game dev, but as someone who has a creative outlet, I understand how much effort goes into the creative process, and it sucks when things that we create don't get the reception that we're hoping for. I cannot imagine how devastating it must be for the devs when their own game gets shut down. It must feel like everything gets pulled out from under them and they don't have anything to show for their efforts, and it probably wasn't their decision to shut down the game at all, and they're sort of stuck dead in the water. Now, don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom, and you might call me an ignorant optimist, but I think the whole situation is important for the game industry. As much as I do sympathize with game devs, if a game is bad, it's bad, and your players are not going to hesitate to tell you. Ultimately, this is good, because I think companies will continue to try to listen to what players want out of games and eventually deliver. And the companies that don't are going to fail eventually. Because it doesn't matter what kind of game a bad game is, whether or not it's single player, multiplayer, or live service, a bad game will be bad, and player reaction is going to reflect that. But for all the bad games and bad companies out there, there are good games and great companies. And more importantly, there are devs that actually care about making the best game possible, instead of cutting costs or greedily inflating prices or spending way too much on stakeholders or any number of infinite problems that might cause problems within game development. And I think that there could be a new live service game in the future that delivers on everything that players want. Are all live service games bad? No. But I think it's a much harder way to make a game, and that's why so many live service titles either have poor reviews or shut down. But I am hopeful for the future to play more great games, and maybe some of them will be live service games. Holy smokes, that video was long. If you stuck around, then thank you. I really appreciate it. This video took a lot longer to finish because of all the research that had to be done, and also because I had the brilliant idea to get a second job. Either way, thank you so much for watching. If you want to support the channel, all you have to do is like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more video essays about the never-ending abyss that are video games. In the meantime, have a good one.